Many times I've heard the phrase, a mother's love knows no bounds. Judging that statement based solely off my own mother's love, I believe it to be true. I wasted quite a few of my early years doing things that probably tested and sought out the boundaries of the love. It began with skipping school in the third grade, followed by my abuse of drugs and alcohol, and then several arrests in my teenage years. Just when I would think, I've done now, she'll surely turn her back on me. She would instead turn toward me with loving and open arms, trying to encourage me and set me back on the straight path. I have a photo of her from 1977, on stage receiving her high school diploma. She had her cap and gown on and was 8 months pregnant. I must have been a trial for her even then, as I'm sure she was on the receiving end of ridicule from family and her peers for being pregnant out of wedlock, times being the way they were then. But to look at her picture, you'd never guess it. She looked proud and happy. Throughout the years, she would take on several roles, sometimes a single mother, counselor, a victim of spousal abuse, but she was always a loving mom. It wasn't until I was arrested for murder and heard my mom wailing and sobbing on the other side of my one phone call that I began to process the pain I was causing her. Before then, my selfishness and immaturity prevented me from seeing that the negative things I did impacted those who loved me, and that my actions had a ripple effect, or rather they created tidal waves, because when I entered the water, I didn't just ease in, I always had to do a cannonball. And while I was in jail awaiting trial, she would drive a long distance to visit me nearly every week, subjecting herself to the rough treatment of the guards so we could visit for 15 minutes. We talked fast so we could pack all we could into that tiny chunk of time. Often, we discussed what the future may hold for me and what this or that lawyer advised as far as the legal strategy goes. From day one, I acknowledged my guilt, but she would tell me numerous times throughout those first couple years that she believed I was innocent and taking the blame for someone else. I can see her now, perched on the edge of the visitation stool, breath held, anticipation on her face, waiting for me to say she's right, because I am innocent. But instead, I would break her heart and mine when I had to tell her every time that, nah, Mom, I'm guilty. I killed that man. I think her determination to will my innocence into existence was her way of trying to shield me from the consequences of my truth. But this wasn't what I made her used to. Scraped knees, skipping school, or some victim of petty crime. No amount of love or admonishment could repair what I'd done and get me back on track. Her hands were tied on this one. Yet she never wavered in her support of me. Her mother's love knows no bounds. At the beginning of my trials, when I learned that another mother, Miss Rice, was impacted by what I'd done, my lawyers whispered to me who she was, with the instructions not to look her way, and definitely don't say anything to her or anyone on that side of the aisle. Not even, I'm sorry. Wouldn't want to give the jury a bad impression. In other words, don't be human. Suppress your emotions. During a trial, emotions are a tool to be manipulated by the prosecution and defense. Over the course of the presentation of our evidence and the state's evidence, I would hear my mother and Daniel's mother crying. Both of them loving mothers. One of them in the process of losing her son, the other son already lost. Divided by the aisle separating the courtroom and divided by my senseless action. At one point, the prosecutor displayed photographs of the crime scene on a huge flat-screen television, ostensibly for the jury to view. The screen was positioned in a way that the jury members had to turn to the right in their chairs to see it. However, it fully faced everyone else in the courtroom. Understandably, Miss Rice loudly wept when her son appeared on the screen. And after court that day, my mother and I discussed why the prosecutor was subjecting Miss Rice to images of her son like that, how he manipulated her pain to make an impact on the jury. We talked about how my mother would feel if instead of Daniel, it was me in those photographs. After I was found guilty and sentenced to die, I was told that I could stand and address the court. I apologized to Miss Rice for what I'd done, and I was sincere. But because of the tornado of emotions I was going through, my apology felt robotic and probably sounded that way also. For 12 years, my mother's love propped me up while I existed on death row. We exchanged letters every week. She ensured that I had funds to purchase the things the state doesn't provide, and she would come to visit as often as possible, bringing along plenty of smiles and assurances that everything will work out and I'll be home one day. Her battle with cancer those last few years was sometimes painfully obvious. The chemo and radiation treatments would deplete her weight and steal her hair. Nevertheless, she would rise smiling, head swathed in a loose fabric, deflecting any questions I had about how she felt and only wanted to hear about me. In January of 2016, the doctors told her that the battle was over and that she had about 6 months to live. Also during that month, I had a court hearing to present evidence of misconduct on the part of one of the jurors at my trial. Evidence that, if the judge deemed substantial, would overturn my sentence and award me a new sentencing hearing to determine if I would receive life without parole or return to death row. Leading up to the day of the hearing, all I could think of was what I would say to Daniel's mom when she was present in the courtroom. I resolved to tell her that I was sorry, even though I'd be reprimanded by the judge for speaking at all. I remember turning in my chair and seeing Miss Rice in the back of the courtroom. In fact, aside from court officials, she was the only one present. She was doing what any loving mother would do, being present to represent her son and fighting for some form of justice. As the hearing got underway and my lawyers began to argue that my sentence should be overturned, I felt ashamed that I was arguing to spare my life in front of the woman whose son's life I didn't spare. At the conclusion, I was led from the courtroom directly past where Miss Rice sat. I couldn't even glance her way, much less say I was sorry. Months later, we were given access to telephones for the first time, and I was able to talk to my mother daily for the last few weeks of her life. We left no stone unturned, and I repeatedly apologized for all the grief I put her through over the years. My last words to her were, "I love you, Mom." And her response was a barely audible, "Love you too." I can't imagine what my life would be like had I not been able to share those last moments with my mother, and how important the opportunity to say goodbye was for me and her. I know that my actions stole that opportunity from another mother, and so if there's any chance that Miss Rice or her family would ever hear this, I want them to know that I'm sorry for what I've done.